The London skyline has evolved rapidly over the past 20 years. It's now dominated by weird and wonderfully shaped buildings with weird and wonderful names. The Shard, the Gherkin, the Cheese-grater, the Walkie Talkie Scorchie. And Sir Simon Jenkins, chairman of the National Trust and regular Evening Standard columnist, has warned that this has all got rather out of hand and that the capital is in danger of becoming a Gulf on Thames. Indeed, current planning applications involve a wall of high-rise developments running from the Shard along the south bank and westwards towards Battersea. These towers will have a significant impact on local communities, historic views and public open space. So the question is, what can we as landscape architects do to mitigate the negative effects of such pressures? So joining us this evening are three distinguished members of the profession, Robert Holden, Tom Turner and Hal Moggridge. Robert Holden is a landscape architect and Londoner. Along with Jamie Liversedge, he is author of Construction for Landscape Architecture, and his next book, Landscape Architecture, An Introduction, appears in February 2014. He is currently working on sustainability projects and is also a member of the LI's Council. And though he does not proclaim himself a Londoner, Tom Turner, born in Woking, I believe, is also a landscape architect, garden designer and garden historian, and also somehow finds time to teach at the University of Greenwich. He's author of numerous books and articles on landscape and gardens, and the editor of the Garden History Reference Encyclopedia CD and the Online Gardens Guide. Our third speaker, Hal Moggridge, began life as an architect, but working in the office of Sir Geoffrey Jellicoe inspired him so much that he decided to change professions to landscape architecture. In 1969, the 70-something Brenda Colvin asked the then 30-something Moggridge to join her as a partner. The company, Colvin & Moggridge, is still very much in business and is now based in Croydon, in South London, and also in the upper reaches of the Thames in Lechlade. In the 1990s, Colvin & Moggridge were appointed as external landscape consultants in London's Royal Parks. Recently, Mr. Moggridge has won international acclaim for his groundbreaking work defining the spatial character of important urban views in both Edinburgh and London, and this has led to his appointment to UNESCO's Historic Urban Landscapes Working Group. And in the 1980s, in recognition of his work, he was awarded the OBE. So those are our speakers for tonight. Now, our programme this evening is as follows. We begin with Robert Holden and Tom Turner, who will cover the history of skyline policy in London, how we landscape architects can contribute to skyline policy, and what we should say and how we can get involved. Now, they will give us some initial ideas towards a proposed landscape draft policy statement. And once approved by the London branch, this statement will then be presented to the GLA. So the intention tonight is to air some initial ideas and to invite anyone interested to get involved in the development of such a policy. So at 8 o'clock, Hal Moggridge will be providing a brief initial response to the policy paper outlines. And then at 8:10, and this is where you need that telephone number, at 8:10 we will open the debate to the floor. And we decided it would be rather cute to get you to actually text in your questions or comments because of the large size of the audience. And we will, in fact, have to limit responses to only 2 minutes per person. And Shelley Moscow will be our timer for this evening. So there we are. That's the programme for this evening. So we'll begin by handing over the floor to Robert and Tom.
Yeah. Can everybody hear at the back? Yeah, nobody can't hear. Good. I'm going to be talking about the background to current policy over the last few hundred years, judging from these slides, and then Tom will be talking about the future in terms of London. So what we have here is a view from Forest Hill of the city, and below we have the one pre-fire view from 1640, which shows the medieval city. And this is post-fire, Canaletto in 1746. The point about London, pressing the wrong way. The point about London then, the upper slide, is that it was a low-rise city. And it's remained a low-rise city in the main, certainly until the year 2000, when there was a change of policy because of the Greater London Authority and the London mayors. The only policies that were effective in the 20th century were based on fire, public safety, and based on particular views, this being one concern, the view of St Paul's. I'm going to be focusing particularly on the river, not only as it a means of escape, but our overall policy is meant to be covering the whole of London. And policies covering the whole of London have not really ever been effective, except on firefighting grounds. Yeah? Never on anything else. Looking post-fire, the big fire of London was 1666. The Act for Rebuilding the City of London described 4 categories, or sorts as they were called, of housing, all defined by height. There were houses of the first sort, which were 2 stories high, houses or buildings of the second sort, which were 3 stories high. There were buildings of the third sort, which were 4 stories high, and there were also fourth rate, which is really top rate, houses, which could be anything you want, providing they're also no more than 4 stories high. Because fires did continue, and they were very concerned about fire, which is why Canaletto in the 18th century had these views, views largely of a city which was no more than 4 stories, with the spires of London and the dome of the London churches, and the dome of St Paul's, and the monument arising above that. The only other exceptions to that would have been shot towers. So you had a city which looked like this. This is the Inns of Court, Temple. That's Fournier Street and Brick Lane. And that's down what was my neck of the woods in Bermondsey, Almagrove, which is 2-storey, or the lowest rate of housing. And this was applied right the way across the city. So that's Fleet Street as it was in the beginning of the 20th century, at the end of the 19th century, and as it's been in recent years. Changes have been, one, largely of intensification of use. Big buildings like the Shelmix House in the middle, or the Adelphi, both of them dating from the 30s and from the 1930s, which supplanted buildings of the same height, but less bulk, less volume. And also the more general use in what was seen as important buildings, office buildings, which was the use of Portland stone, which is quite a good material to use, a matter of concern regarding contemporary architecture. Portland stone, white, tends to be recessive against the skyline, while glass tends to be black, never in the architect's views, but actually, in fact, tends to be dark and black as a silhouette, as you saw demonstrated with the first slide. Oops, pressing the wrong one. So fires continued, firefighting continued, and firefighting restrictions were particularly imposed by the London County Council towards the end of the 19th century in 1896, largely because of this building, Queen Anne's Mansions, which are now number 2 Petty France, which is where the Ministry of Justice is. Described by Pevsner as an irredeemable horror, the concern was both the impact on St James's Park and also the view from Buckingham Palace. Apparently Queen Victoria was concerned towards the Houses of Parliament, Victoria Tower, and Big Ben, as it's known. Point is, this was viewed as being high-rise. This was viewed as being very, very high at the end of the 19th century. 1894, I should have said. 1894, LCC, in response, introduced two restrictions. One, which is for buildings in streets greater than 50 feet wide, 15 metres, that they should be no more than 80 feet. Yeah? Excluding the top a couple of stories at the top, which would be above the eve lines. But for small streets, they should be no higher than existing street pattern, no higher than the existing buildings in the street. Yeah? And that largely continued. So fire was one concern, God was another concern, it was an exception. You could aspire, you could build higher. Context was the other concern. Yeah? Until 1930, when the height, firemen's ladders got longer, it was raised to what was 100 feet or 30 metres. That was particularly pushed by buildings like Faraday House, this one, telephone exchange, right in front of St Paul's. And in response to that, we have our first effective policy, which is based on the look of London, on an aesthetic issue, because particularly St Paul's, St Paul's Cathedral, the clergy were highly concerned to have this telephone exchange right in front of it. And the St Paul's height policy has continued and has a dramatic effect on the city. It's not ever been a statutory policy, it's been a policy which the city has implemented, but it's worked. And that, I would say, has been the one really effective policy. As a result of that, all the tall building, high-rise building in the City of London is towards the northeast. And one of our arguments would be that you should have concentrations or clusters of high-rise buildings, given that we now have a city which includes high-rise. This is another view of Faraday House on the bottom right, and that's how it looked before it was built in the 1920s. That's how it looks now. Other exceptions in the 1930s were buildings such as Senate House or the London Transport Building, 55 Broadway, or going back to the 19th century, the Victoria Tower in the Houses of Parliament, that being largely a paper store. Post-war Town and Country Planning Act, 1947, intensification of use, rights of replacement for existing structures, and permitted increase in size up to 10%. Basically what they're doing is narrowing corridors, lowering the ceilings, and increasing the amount of usable, therefore lettable or saleable floor space by 40%. No need to increase the height of the buildings. Going into the 1950s, County of London plan, particularly effective use of plot ratio. So the example is given in the city below. Zones range from 2 to 1, which is pretty low rise, I would suggest, to 5.5 to 1 of floor area, of ground space. End of the 100-foot restriction, 1954, and as a result of that, you get limited high-rise of this nature. For example, the LCC did object to these. You'd got the Hilton, the one on the left, and Basil Spencer's Kensington Barracks on the right-hand side when viewed from Hyde Park. And here you see the comparison with, say, New York. This isn't the high-rise side of Central Park, New York. 1956, the LCC confirmed its commitment to plot policy and spelled out that its concerns were disruption of the pattern of existing development or obtruding onto the skyline, making a positive visual contribution to the city, and in addition, appropriate to the site in terms of size and location. That actually is largely transport, as being exceptions to the general policies which have been maintained heretofore. The consequence of that is you get buildings which are not particularly objectionable, I would suggest, such as the Millbank Tower or the Shell Centre. But remember, when these were built in going up in the 1950s, these were the highest buildings in London. They were quite remarkable. Yeah? So you've got a largely low-rise city, just like Paris, just like Amsterdam, just like Oslo, just like Helsinki. You could go on, just like Berlin. And of course, what is now the Telecom Tower, also in the 1960s. Very limited high-rise, not oppressive high-rise, not a general scattering of high-rise. GLC policy, Greater London Council, from 1963, it spelled out its concerns for the general skylines of London as being concerns of visual intrusion, location, site size, overshadowing, local character, effects on the Thames and open space, architectural quality and night scene. So you've got things really spelled out. And here we have a very significant building. I do apologise for the quality of the image. It's the only one I was able to find because it's a die-line print. But basically what the GLC spelled out was the idea of an all-London policy related to topography, related to landscape. Makes sense to me, I would suggest, as we're all landscape architects or interested, I suppose. So, areas where high buildings are inappropriate are shown in dark tint. That's completely been thrown by the by, as you'll see later on. Areas which are particularly sensitive to high buildings are shown in medium tint, and areas where you can have a more flexible or positive approach are shown without tint. Lots of Bromley over there, and the two lines which cross are telecommunication channels. I don't understand what the telecommunication channels are, except I do know that they intersect at the Euston Tower, where MI6 then had its offices. So I suppose they were to do with the Euston Tower. If anybody knows, please enlighten me. So generally those sort of policies, as you've seen illustrated by those previous images, were held, and indeed the GLC was supported by central government right the way through the 70s and into the 80s, its abolition, and those policies effectively were continued until GLC abolition in 1986, but more significantly, beyond then, until the year 2000. The London you now see today emerging is a London which is largely the creation of the last 13 years. It's very recent, yeah? And the point is, one of the things I'll be pointing out, is that a lot of it you haven't seen yet, because there's quite a lot of high-rise buildings which have got planning permission, and they've not emerged much out of the ground. So this is an example of the sort of building that was which the GLC did not support and was not called in by central government. This is Mansion House, the Mies van der Rohe scheme, right by the centre of the city. James Sterling subsequently did a building there. Come 1980, you get the setting up of the London Docklands Development Corporation with its own powers, and that led, from 1990 onwards, first of all to the Caesar Pellet Tower, which was on a far higher scale than the LDDC had imagined possible beforehand. It wasn't so much because of the London Docklands Development Corporation. It was simply that they allowed planning permission. It was more because of the American developers, G. Ware, Travelstead, and then the Reichman brothers, who were basically recreating a Dallas-Fort Worth or wherever Battery Park City type development. They were just transplanting it here. Other than the fact that it was very difficult to get to, and that's been put right subsequently by retrofitting with public transport at public expense. In other words, the Jubilee Line extension, the Docklands Light Railway, it's actually quite a good policy, I would suggest, and a good precedent for the sorts of policies that we might well be suggesting. A dispersed set of clusters throughout London, but that I'll leave more to Tom and possibly for Hal to comment as well. 1986, end of the GLC, County Hall on the left, and effectively London strategic planning moved to what was then the Marsham Street Towers. That's my only shot, but it's one thing that we can celebrate, the end of those towers, because they were behind the Houses of Parliament. So effectively it was a Department of Environment governing strategic planning throughout London. All this time, indeed from the time of the Greater London Development Plan in whenever it was, 76, effective view policies had been proclaimed. This is one view policy, which is a view from Richmond Park, Henry's Mount, if you know it. And this is an iteration of the Greater London Development Plan by central government, the Government Office for London, in 1991. It's practically unreadable, so that's a more readable version of it. So you can see the origins of these view lines, yeah, and you can see where their views to. So from, well, possibly you can't actually, from Primrose Hill or from Richmond Park to St Paul's, from Primrose Hill to Westminster, and vice versa as well in terms of Greenwich. That has been maintained by the mayors of London as a policy. The effectiveness of that policy is what is under doubt, or what I would question today. The idea of view lines is that you have a background, which is in yellow on that image. You have a cone or corridor, which is in orange, and you have a consultation area, well, which is in the darker reddish colour, brownish colour, and then, or beige colour maybe, and then you have the orange colour, which is the outside of the corridor, which is a consultation area, but is not so effectively upheld. So there you've got the strategic views of the city, St Paul's, in 1991. The wider consultation area, viewing corridors, wider consultation area, background consultation area, shown in the three different colours. Mayor of London subsequently then introduces additional policies. One, the idea of panoramas. Any Greenwich students possibly been to Primrose Hill, which is why I put this one up. Linear views. There are just a couple. There's the Mall, well, three. The Mall, Westminster Pier to St Paul's, and King Henry's Mount, Richmond Park to St Paul's Cathedral. And finally, river prospects. River prospects can be described as being views from all the river, from Lambeth Bridge downstream. So we'll put everything in Vauxhall behind us, as far as Tower Bridge, where we can look both downstream and upstream, so every bridge in between. That makes some sort of sense. Right, wrong one. I now want to introduce World Heritage Sites, because they also require to be seen. Yeah? We have 4 in London. Palace of Westminster, St Margaret's and Westminster Abbey is one area. Well, it's actually 2 areas, but it's being merged. The Tower of London, Maritime Greenwich, and the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. I would suggest that Maritime Greenwich at the moment and the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, certainly in terms of views towards them, are not particularly threatened. What one is more concerned about are the views of Westminster and the views of the Tower of London. There we've got Westminster. Now, here I'm going to go to and fro, because that, in green, is the World Heritage Site area. In a yellowish colour, you've got the area which in 2007 they described as a buffer zone, as a proposed establishment. So far it's not actually been established. It's not been ratified by anybody. But the point is that Westminster, who are on the left, are very much concerned about developments and are objecting to developments in Waterloo which are outside that buffer area. Yeah? Because, of course, from Westminster you can see beyond. And so they've been very concerned about, say, Elizabeth House, which is just by Waterloo Station, off to the top right, for example. And so you get responses like this. Westminster under threat. Currently, there's only one British World Heritage Site which is on the endangered list that UNESCO run, which is the Liverpool river frontage. Yeah? But UNESCO come along, they're concerned, they're patted on the head, told to go away, and we'll go ahead and do whatever we want to do. I think has been broadly the policy. This is the Tower of London, with in red the buffer zone, which is now set in local plans. Yep. The view from the Tower Bridge of the Tower of London to the right, and then what's happening beyond, with Vernoli's Walkie Talkie. How on earth Peter Rees of the City of London gave that permission, I don't know. Anyway, that's the response that you get. These are the other two. London Planning Advisory Committee was set up during the departure of the Greater London Authority, and it continued and developed further the GLC policies, and was very much taken over by the first Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone. In fact, I would say there's hardly any difference in terms of mayoral policy in relation to high-rise between Ken Livingstone and Boris Johnson. Both of them have been pro-high-rise. Yeah? The Mayor of London, or mayoral document, quotes LPAC, the argument being it's first and foremost not one of economic need. It's an issue of image. You want to be big. By the way, they're both two pretty heterosexual males, aren't they? I think a lot of this is about phallocentrism, actually. Aesthetics, local public transport and servicing capacity. Yeah. So you get this sort of thing happening. That's 1991, that's 2007, and there you can see the difference. They're getting squeezed. GLA Plan 2011. This is interesting in that it echoes the 1666 idea of London. The central areas are 4 to 6 stories. Well, in many areas they're not. Urban areas are 4 stories, and then suburban areas are 3 stories. What are the problems of tall buildings? Overshadowing, wind turbulence, not street friendly, design reservations, congestion, sustainability concerns, health concerns, intrusion, terrorism target. I'm not going to show shots of the World Trade Tower. What's a good example? Well, I would suggest to you that San Francisco's policies over the years have been fairly coherent. We have a cluster there. Of course, San Francisco is 10 times smaller than London, and you can compare that with Canary Wharf, which has followed the same sort of policies until very recently. I shan't read through that. We shan't go through that. You've got a glimpse of it. Maybe we can put it somewhere. So we've got strategic locations for tall buildings as of now. This is Lambeth. Lambeth want Vauxhall and Waterloo. Southwark are a bit more greedy. They want the Elephant, London Bridge and Blackfriars Road. The city has already got all those high-rise areas. Actually, what's happening is that these are merging, yeah, in terms of planning applications currently. The light blue is distinguishing boroughs. North of the river, they've used a dashed line to distinguish Westminster and so on. This area is Southwark. That area is Lambeth. And that area is Lewisham. It doesn't actually say that. You've got to suss it out. What's happening here? My contention was, just a geological surface plan, is that high-rise policy should be determined, in part, with the advice of landscape architects in relation to the landscape, in relation to both geology and topography. That's a contention. It needs to be voiced. And here's just a flip through of what's happening at the moment. All these schemes that I've shown, this Vauxhall Cross Towers, St George's Wharf Tower, they've all got planning permission. This one's actually completed now. But the point is that none of these views show them composed. That doesn't show all of those, but it shows a couple of them. So that's what's happened to Vauxhall. Blackfriars, this view, this is the Beeston Towers. Another high-rise here, another high-rise here. This has already been built. This is the Rogers scheme, which I can show you in a moment. So they're not being composed, they're not being considered, which is why I quote the example of San Francisco. So that's the Rogers Harbour and Partners scheme to the right of the Tate. And then we've got in between Ludgate House, which has now got planning permission. Yeah? Shell Centre. It's all right, Tom's going to get squeezed. It's okay, we agreed beforehand. Yeah. Next to the Shell Centre, you've got Doon Street Tower. Yeah? And behind the Shell Centre, you've got Elizabeth House. I've got a good view from the river of Elizabeth House, so you can compare it. It's the one in the middle, as you can see. And that's been objected to, but been granted planning permission, despite the objections of English Heritage and of Westminster, because of its effects on the views from the Houses of Parliament. I'm just showing that I'm not particularly getting involved in how these skyscrapers meet the ground, but I would suggest to you, although it's by David Chipperfield, who can handle small developments quite well, that is going to be, one, it's going to be windy, and two, it's going to be north-facing. Yep, because that's, unless the magnetic north changes, so you won't get that view. It's going to be a shady area. Yeah? And that's a view from York Road, facing the Shell building, which will be, in a sense, extended, opposite. So we're producing a New York-style canyon. And this is London Bridge. London Bridge, we already know the Shard, but remember you've got the relatively low-rise place behind it, which now looks like that when viewed from Borough High Street. And then you've got the Quill, which is charmingly named. Apparently it's because of the area's literary connotations, which is on the other side, or next to it effectively, just by the railway viaduct. The one effective policy that we do have since the Shard has been the Civil Aviation Authority limit of 1,000 feet, which is 305 metres. Yep. Editor Tom.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Robert. I learned a lot from that. Thank you. I think to a degree, I got the short straw there. I think talking about the past is a little easier than talking about the future. But what we're obviously concerned with is the growth of London. Robert's shown us how it's grown in the last 2 or 3 centuries. I've somewhat exaggerated the height of the Walkie Talkie. It may happen. We cannot know, but we should look ahead. Capability Brown planted trees which were going to mature in 100, 200 years' time. That's the duty of our profession, to look ahead. These are the points I want to make, and then I'm going to ramble about a little bit, making some serious points and some whimsical points, and you'll have to decide for yourselves when I'm serious and when I'm whimsical. But these are all serious points. It's very important for the City of London to look back to its history. We need to conserve and protect and respect and love its heritage. It's also very important to look to the future. And I think that part of the reason that these funny buildings have been able to creep in is that there has been a lack of a future vision as to how London might be. A second point is that I dislike the fact that the current debate is about high buildings. It's not enough. It's a step in the right direction to talk about skylines and about composition, but really they should both be an aspect of an urban landscape policy. Robert's already made the point that although we're primarily talking about the Thames, our interest is within the whole of London. Another very important point, that we see this as an example of a policy initiative from a Landscape Institute, and we have prepared a paper arguing for over 100 of such policy initiatives to take place, and so it only seemed fair to have a go at doing one ourselves to start it off, which is why we accepted to do this. But what we're looking to in this respect is what I regard as the glory days of the Landscape Institute, when under Hal Moggridge's first boss, Geoffrey Jellicoe, he poured out policy statements, that's why we're here today. He created the landscape architecture profession by putting out statements on new towns. He got the word landscape architecture written into the New Towns Act, on the landscape of forestry, of reservoirs, of power, of industry. And that created the work which we now do. And if we want to, as I trust we do, to get the profession more work, to get the profession better work, and to make London and the world a better place, then we believe a lot of effort should go into these policy statements. Robert and I, we'll do one, we're not going to do 100.
Not this year.
And so that's why we've circulated a draft statement, because it needs to come from everybody. Robert and I have drafting assistants, but it comes from everybody. And you can see it written there, and also the link at the bottom there, I've put it on the Garden Visit website. It's not linked into the website, but you can find it. So, the debate, as I say at present, is about high buildings. And when you look for around the world, London's view of them is somewhat anomalous. If you look up lists of the world's top skylines, I've just given you two on the left as representative, one from Arabian Business. They're all skyscraper frontages. One from the Landscape Architecture Network. They're all skyscrapers. And most of them are. There's a whole lot of them. They're all skyscrapers. The only exception I could find was from pps.org, which is a wonderful website, and they like historic cities. And to get some more historic cities, I had to do my own list. And I've given you, Istanbul, Varanasi, and my hometown as favourite skylines. My father was in the army, and when he came out, he was demobbed. He went to live in Woking, and as soon as I was born, we went to Edinburgh, and so Edinburgh is my hometown. Now, the case for high buildings is much the same as the case for stilettos. They're a fashion statement. You can tell your partner, you can tell your daughter that they have no function. You're not likely to stop her from wearing them. Correct me if I'm wrong. And there's a very well-considered report from the House of Commons onto the need or otherwise for high buildings. And they say there isn't a case for it. You can accommodate the development with high-density, low-rise instead, but people want it they want them for branding reasons and as sex symbols. It's a bit like a man buying a sports car. And so, in thinking about them, we're not advocating them. We're saying, where are the least bad places to put these things, if put they must be? Now, this is the view, the protected view, as Robert's shown us, of St Paul's from Fleet Street. And I'd just like a little bit of audience participation, please. The 2000, I've extracted the building from it, is as it was. And then when they built the Cheese-grater, Richard Rogers' design, they built it as a wedge because that would protect the view of St Paul's Cathedral. So I've given you three alternatives at the bottom. A shows, can I just have a show of hands for each of them as we go through, please, which of you prefer? A is what they wanted to build because they've lost half their floor space in protecting the view of St Paul's. So was it worth it? Have they improved the view of St Paul's? No. They have. You prefer you prefer this one? No. You prefer this one to this one because it was boring skyline.
No, sorry, I thought you meant is C, but
you might be torn apart.
Is the top right better than A? Yes. And the top right is better than A.
I see. Yeah, okay, yeah. So, well, what about B then? They talk about pepper potting in the city. So this is I got it from Rome Airport. This pepper pot. What about C? Does anybody prefer C to the Cheese-grater? I mean, I don't think there wasn't a proper debate about it. That's the point. London was, as Robert's shown us, a city of spires. The Tower, St Paul's, Southwark Cathedral, and Westminster Abbey, they're all now as they were. And it then became a city of blocks. There's a 1980 aerial photograph. And it's amazing how blocky it's become. This is the Commercial Union Building, which is now called St Helens. And then, by 2005, it was bursting up further. I mean, that's when it started to go wonky. And since then, we've got these things come to it. A city of towers, a city of spires, blocks, towers, I think. And this is a couple of pages from a book I wrote in 1996. And I put in it this cartoon with saying that that was the direction that cities seem to be going. And I wrote that it's an anything goes postmodernism, and this pluralist approach gives us the equivalent of the junk shop with perhaps an empty chocolate box, a kettle, and an old TV set. And I has been built. And so what I think happened, that I drew this diagram as a cautionary tale. And they got to read it in architecture schools, and they thought, well, so this is the next best thing. Let's build it, boys. Let's build it. So what's the next big thing? The city does seem to be mushrooming, and if you look at the pigeons here, they're obviously turning their backs on that development. But what could happen is that the tendency for sort of bulbous-topped buildings could go further, and should that happen, we'd like to see them composed. And it's not such a ridiculous idea as you may think. If you look at the Walkie Talkie building, Fenchurch Street, it's got a great sky garden on top. Now, they discovered in the Shard you can charge £25 a person to go and see the view. And the restaurant on top of the Heron Tower, it's about £150 for a meal. And so there's a real economic case, a financial case, I should say, for doing this. And Bevis Marks there, both these are just completing now. Bevis Marks has got an unenclosed roof garden on top, and the Walkie Talkie one is a greenhouse being designed by Gillespie's. I'm very happy to see both those things happening, and so that's why I think that the mushroom form may be not quite so ridiculous as your laughter indicated. And so then one wonders what's going to happen to the city underneath, and it's more interesting than you'd think. And I couldn't find good enough images of ice caves, because that seems to me the direction that it's going. It might become, you see it a bit here, the tall glazed buildings, they reflect light into the dark corridors. And look at this. This is the walkie-talkie thing, and it's obviously it's facing south. And look at the light it's reflecting into this previously dark alley. And you could fry an egg outside here at one point, it was so hot. But it's like stage lighting, isn't it? It's got, and then if you look at this photograph, which was taken when Robert and I were walking around, see that black thing there? That's rain. It was pouring with rain when I took the photograph, and it sheltered, because of the bulbous building. And so it's possible that if there was thoughtful, calculated landscape design for it, that one could make a remarkable environment inside the city, because the high buildings, they're much closer together than in other cities because of the medieval street pattern. And so it would be possible to arrange it so that it's sheltered, light, and sunny. These were my first thoughts from another book, 1998, about high buildings. And I live in Greenwich. And so I took that photograph when I first got there. And then when this was built in 1997, what I wrote is that Urban Island in London's Docklands was built between 1985 and 95. Tall buildings look best when they're grouped together. So I might also want to claim credit for the City of London's high buildings policy. And it's worked, I think it's well composed. I'll come back to that view later on. This is very interesting too. This is Patrick Abercrombie, who was on the council of the Landscape Institute when he did the County of London and the Greater London plans. And he also wrote a book on town planning in practice. It's 1933. And he took just the kind of long-term forward view that we should all be taking. He's really just as important as Jellicoe in the history and definition of the landscape profession. But look at these cross-sections he's got of cities. It's a wonderful diagram. I'm a connoisseur of diagrams, and this is a most brilliant thing. He shows typical English town at the top, which is London as we know it, and then the garden city. I think he was a bit doubtful about garden cities. I mean, architects, they tended to be a bit sniffy of them because they thought of them as being suburban sprawl. And then a continental town, still within its city wall, like Brussels. The future city is obviously thinking of Manhattan with that, but it looks like a design plan for Canary Wharf, doesn't it? And then I suspect him of favouring the Corbusian city, although he doesn't come out very openly about it, but he liked it. It was a landscape-based plan. The reason for putting people up in Corbusier's time was to free the space at ground level. And if that's our view, we should argue for it. And extrapolating from Abercrombie's plan, I did these diagrams. The top one to show the pepper potting, which everybody agrees is horrible, across London. And then another section to show what they were doing from Greenwich Park. And then I thought, well, why not, instead of just having, we're landscape architects, we understand more than flat and pinnacles. We understand all this sort of thing as well. And so why not have a roofscape contour plan for the future development of the city to try and make a sort of sculptured and wonderful surface. So that was the idea of that. And so far nobody's taken up this idea. Here's another interesting thought. These are some more montages thinking about Camillo Zita's ratio. He said that for a public open space, the best thing is to have a ratio somewhere between 1 to 1 and 1 to 2 of the height to the width, so that if you've got a building like that, the open space should come to here. That was his view. And so one wonders whether that applies to the Shard. There's the height of the Shard, it's 306, and the width of the Thames there is 265 metres. So the ratio is 1 to 0.86, but it's 150 metres further back from the river, and that brings it pretty well to what Zita was arguing for. But which do you prefer? There's 4 different... There it is with no Shard. So can I have a show of hands for A, B, C and D? I want you to hold up your hand for the one you prefer, please. Just give you 10 seconds to think. Who prefers A? We could really do with a monitor for this. It looks like only about 10 people. You've got to put your hand up. We can have no abstentions. We should have explained that. How does A? It's higher. There's 3 different heights for the shard. That's the difference between them. I just want to know which height you prefer for the shard. It's highest at the top, and it's shortest in the second, and it's middling in the third. So who prefers B, which is the smallest of my 3 shards? Okay, that's still... it's more than A. And C... thank you. And D. Well, what you voted for, do you know what you voted for? Yes, exactly. Yes, you voted for the height that it is. My belief, I'll explain this in more detail. I've got a video, actually, of all this, which I'll set to run when we have the discussion, and so you'll see all these cross-sections shown in a video. But what I believe is that it needs an old-fashioned scenic quality assessment. I don't think that the current landscape character assessment is sufficient. I think it's sitting on the fence. And that as a profession, we need to say, this is the best bit. In scenic terms, in landscape terms, this is the best. We've got to be brave about that. And then also, and this is the worst. So there are the cross-sections which you'll see. And Robert's done a better version of it than this. I did this very, very quickly. But it shows, using heat map colours, which I thought, it's only 10 minutes work, are the best and the worst sections of the river. And it should then become used to assess for the sensitivity. We're then saying to Londoners, look, this is the best bit of scenery, and therefore the most sensitive to dramatic change, and that this is the least good bit, and therefore the least sensitive. And I think that's the thing as a profession we ought to do. There's a big demand for it. And I think that we've ducked by going for landscape character assessment, which is too much geography rather than aesthetic judgment. This is Patrick Abercrombie again, his wonderful open space plan. This is the section for the banks of the Thames. And that funny graphic device he's got, it's a statistical method of analysing the proportion of land uses along the river, existing and proposed. And what he proposed took me years to realise this, so I've coloured it up in red to make it easy for you. All these areas shown in red, he proposed should be new riverside open spaces. This was his own initiative. I mean, the government said to him, in 1943 he did it, they said it'd be nice to have an open space, a London plan to cheer people up. And what went into it was entirely his own responsibility. And I think that's how it has to be. I don't think that commissions are going to come for the kind of work that's needed. And it's therefore necessary for us to argue as to what kind of work we can do to make a better London and a better world. But many of those red spaces have come into being. And it's a terrific thing to look ahead like that and say, this is what London needs for new open spaces. He made a few mistakes, but I won't go into them. I do, however, very much agree with him that the banks of the Thames are a special planning and design zone. And they're designated as such. It's called the Thames Policy Area. But they've agreed that far, but they haven't considered, as far as I can tell, what sorts of policies apply in the Thames policy area. And so I think it's much better. They just sort of survey the existing buildings and say, these are all special, which isn't looking forward in the way that Abercrombie did. So thinking about what might happen in this Thames policy area, and looking at the strange graphics of his plan, it reminded me of Friedensreich Hunterwasser's approach to landscape and architecture. Hundertwasser was, of course, an artist. The architects detested him because he was getting involved in architecture, which they thought was their exclusive thing. And he just worked by doing models. And then it was up to everybody else to build them. And there are some examples of his work. This is the spa at Blumau. And the circulation plan is wonderful, actually. The pedestrian circulation is underneath these glass-roofed corridors, and the vehicular circulation is entirely underneath the building. So the whole site is completely pedestrianised. You don't see a road anywhere. And, I mean, you may or may not like the architecture, won't comment on that, but it's a wonderful thing to have the vegetation swooping over the buildings like that. And then one sees in Singapore, the School of Art, Media and Design, they haven't managed the vegetation half as well. It's got sprinklers, and there may be a no entry sign. I don't know about that. But again, one sees the vegetation's swooping up and round, and it's wonderful. So, could it be done in London, one asks oneself. Here's one of these accurate visual representations, is the technical term for it. They're geometrically accurate. Names Robert showed, mostly they put the water like a Hawaiian swimming pool, and they're generally deceitful. So, and see my photograph, which is honest, shows that was on a sunny day. I didn't do anything to it. That's how it actually looks, which isn't quite. And so I just wonder if we could have got Hundertwasser to do it. If we might not have had a sky park along the river there. And now when we look downstream from Tower Bridge, it's more cliffs than pool. And so one thinks, well, if it is cliffs, then why not do the job properly? And it's wonderful to have a Hundertwasser sweeping shape at roof level. And it probably could have been done, I think. One could designate a Thames policy area and say that all roofs will be publicly accessible green space because it's overlooking the river, and I think it could have been done. Now, Singapore has a skyline which, like most skylines, look pretty grim in the daytime, but far, far better at night. And it's got, in the Marina Bay Hotel, a sky park. It's that thing that looks like a monorail about to, next Tay Bridge disaster, to plunge into the sea. It's the sky park in the lower photograph. And that would have been a public good extracted from the developers, which should be a wonderful thing from the future of London, to have a sort of snaking sky park at roof level. I told you a few of the suggestions were whimsical. And then that's the model in the building centre, with a little bit of Kensington Gardens montaged on top of it. This is some earlier attempts from me at rooftop landscapes. This was an article in 1995. And I think I was learning Photoshop, which was the reason I did that. I put it on the Gardenvisit website. I had innumerable requests to reproduce it from some primary schools in Minnesota and architecture schools and foreign. And this one was done as at the time of financial crisis. I thought that sheep, rooftop, these are sheep, rooftop level would calm down the bankers. And there's another diagram up at the top. But this is more serious. I'm not happy with the green infrastructure that the Landscape Institute, following the government, has put its weight behind. It's good, but it's not enough. It's not nearly enough. It's not thought out either in aesthetic terms or in functional terms. It's just sort of, let's get rid of surface water. Well, of course we should manage surface water, but there's more to it than that. And so what it needs is a network of ways threading through the city. On the left, they're categorized in emotional terms, a white way being a spiritual place, a place like a church, a place, oh gosh, it's eating into your time. I have to speed up.
I'm going to kick the dog in a moment. You'll know what it means.
Oh, yeah, when you run across, I'll know it's time to finish, well, actually. Okay. So the ones on the left are in emotional terms. The red way is the idea red is an exciting place, a shopping street or busy crowds. And on the right, it gives functional categorizations to them. So one is a cycleway, and one's a paved route running through the city, and one's a parkway, and one's something. Our bridleway. I've always been very keen on playing for horses in cities. Now, on this argument against pepper potting and in favour of clustering, we've got the House of Commons on our side and we've got the City Corporation on our side, and so we scarcely need to argue that, but it's been very nice for them to have a profession which is supporting them. It's what people want. There's some pepper pots, so you can understand why they don't want it. And I don't think it would be very much better if they were scenically composed either. This is my much loved pepper grinder from Fiumicino Airport. So there's my question. Edinburgh has a skyline policy with some drawings from it on the right, done by Holden and Moggridge, and London doesn't. I believe that London needs it and that nobody else is going to argue the case for it except for us, and that we should do it. Oh, there are some alternative professions. And one last little bit of audience participation. Who thinks the RICS should be responsible for this? No? The RIBA? No. The RTPI? No. The Landscape Institute? Oh! Well, there's the policy statement. You've got that, so I'm not going to go through it. It's better. I would if I had time, but you can read it instead, or we can come back to it. But there's my own conclusion, that a skyline policy is a very fine thing, but it should be an aspect of a landscape policy, an urban landscape policy. And the top panorama, which was taken last week, it's beautiful, isn't it? It's wonderful to see the landscape architects, John Evelyn and André Lenot designed the foreground, and the trees compose the foreground to the background view. And then, remember I was going like this earlier? Well, it's happened, hasn't it? You know, the cluster of the city, which looks it does, doesn't it? And I think this one is better. But this is the hated pepper potting, which is that section there. And that's what most of London's like, and it's a mistake. So I've only got my video to show now, and I'll need to get that working again when we get to the discussion. And then I'll hand over to Hal, but I better fix up. I'm going to put Hal's on.
Well, it's quite interesting that, in fact, while we were working for the Royal Parks, we did propose, as part of the London plan, a sort of the beginnings of a skyline policy related to the parks, of course. And it was completely turned down. We got a prize in Europe for it, and we also had this job in Edinburgh, which was very nice because the people of Edinburgh love their views. So I'm just going to show about a dozen pictures bringing out some of the points which I think are important, many of which have been mentioned. The first thing which I think landscape architects should be very conscious of is microclimate. And there are two towers here. One is the Heron Tower, which doesn't really affect the microclimate, but the Bishopsgate Tower, which is not yet built, is so placed in relation to Bishopsgate that there will be 4 months of shadow in Bishopsgate, which at present is a road which at lunchtime everybody goes out into to enjoy the sun. And this was not noticed, partly because the person who was in charge of climate said that at 10 o'clock in the morning there would be a shadow in such and such a direction. I looked at the report. I'm going to try. Another thing that's been mentioned that I think we should continuously emphasize where it's important is that you don't need towers to make density. This was a proposal for Victoria Station on the right with 2 huge towers, prepared for Icamos on the left, the same amount of accommodation with an urban space in front of Victorian Station and gaps facing west and east so that morning and evening sun can get into the urban space. We can put these sort of diagrams forward when things are being planned, in my view. That's been talked about. I think the background of historic buildings is immensely important. We were told about the resistance at Bishopgate to having high buildings behind St Paul's. That's what you see on the right. The Bishopsgate buildings are there. But a building has now been consented, which is the view from the south end of Waterloo Bridge, and in my view diminishes St Paul's in a very vulgar way. It's said to be a good building. What that means is well detailed. It's an extremely bad building. Now I come to one of the views in London which we tried very hard to conserve but have failed. This view has been described by Ian Nan as the most romantic view in London, and by Pevsner as the finest publicly accessible piece of picturesque landscape in London. In the London plan of 2004, it was designated as a special view, so you would have thought it would be protected. It is interesting because the City of London is behind it. The height of the buildings is such that they're not visible from that wonderful view of St James's Park Bridge. The first task we had related to high buildings in the parks was to resist a building of the height of that red arrow, the Millennium Tower, on the site of the Gherkin. And we, with many other people, succeeded in resisting that building, and the Gherkin was built instead. And you can see it's the right height. And we have to, I think of the height of buildings related to their position. And so I think this shows very clearly how the city, a very huge building, 200-metre high building, is not visible in that important view. Now, unfortunately, in a public inquiry, the Doon Street Tower was proposed, and this was the first of the proposals. And this tower is above the island, and you can see in the cross-section at the top, and this is another thing that landscape architects can do very specially, is draw lots and lots of cross-sections, because cross-sections are the way places are seen together. And you can see how the rising sightline from this view goes up, allowing 100-metre tall buildings on the right-hand side of the picture, but the Doon Street Tower is too high for its position. The public inquiry took place. The inspector recommended that the building should not be built because it would be damaging both to this important view and to Somerset House, where it appears. However, the minister overturned her inspector, considering that the impact on the view would not be as great as the inspector fears and would not be unacceptable. Now, I think this is a very feeble way, not as great as the inspector fears. We want something better than that. We want wonderful views, not something not quite as bad as the inspector fears. This view should never have had any high buildings showing in it, but now there are a whole lot of consented buildings, not quite as high as the blue line yet, but there are consented buildings all the way across that view. So that view is lost. I think we have to accept that, which has been very sad for me, certainly. One of the drawings that was put forward for the public inquiry at Doon Street was this one. This is a photo montage of the building as proposed. It has several lines in it. One is that it's very faint sort of weather for distant buildings. I haven't spotted the building, but I expect you have. The other thing is that this rather intimate view has turned into something about the size of the water in front of New York, a huge lake going away. In fact, it's an intimate place. So there are two tricks here. One is wide-angle lens, and the other is false view of the tones. And I think we need to be aware as landscape architects how people see things. The first thing is that the mind exaggerates the height of things. So this is a drawing meant to be an honest drawing of Siena compared with a photograph. And you can see that The high buildings are exaggerated. And that is the way it is. And the other thing is that this right-hand photograph of an ant, where the close-up photograph focuses on one little bit only, is how the eye sees. And then the eye darts from place to place and takes in a total picture, and the mind puts it all together. But for this reason, the mind can pick out individual small parts of a view and see it very clearly. So you can see a spire 3 miles away very clearly. And that's because the actual eye sees like that picture of the ant. And we need to promote this knowledge. It's all well known. Hogarth described this in 1765, I think. Now, at present, I'm trying with ICOMOS to protect some of the views that are left of the Westminster World Heritage Site. These are unprotected views of Westminster World Heritage Site from the front of National Gallery at the bottom, with people taking photographs. No protection of that at all. Westminster Abbey from the Mall and the Park. Big Ben at the bottom right from the front of Buckingham Palace, a tremendous tourist place. And top right, Big Ben from the Park, which I can just show you an analysis of that. And this, with ICOMOS, we've done analyses of how to protect 12 views of the Westminster World Heritage Site. And the hope is it'll be published and will be taken notice of. And you can see you've got a rising sight line with this cross-section, and it's not much of a limitation. By the time you're getting, 2 kilometres away from the Thames, you can have buildings nearly 200 metres high, which is very high buildings. We're not talking about small buildings, but when you're close on this view line, then you've got to be more restrained. And finally, a thing which hasn't been picked out, but I would like to add to what's been said, is parklands in cities. There's so much known about how parklands relieve stress, and research has shown that, to quote Dr. Grahn, a short walk through a park, even a short 10-minute walk, is of great value when it comes to alleviating stress. However, people must leave the noise, sights and the smells of the town behind them. So secluded areas in parkland are of immense importance. And we actually did the same as Tom and put this forward to the GLC, Greater London Authority it is now, that they should do something like this and look at the city of London, or London as a whole, and think about the heights of buildings and draw a contour plan of the bottom of the open sky for the whole of London. This actual diagram, the first effort, is not accurate. It shouldn't be taken too seriously. The lines are too low. And in fact, when we worked in Edinburgh, it needs to be more fragmented than that. But I think this concept is something that we as an institute should promote, that the open sky across the whole of London should be designed properly. Thank you.
I haven't come here to speak. I've come to set my video running. Who's going to manage the discussion?
I guess I am.
Oh, that's good. Just while he's getting in gear. One of the policies we've argued for is that there should be a publicly maintained digital model of London in order to be able to generate masses of perspectives. At present, they ask applicants, the developers, to produce a verified planning image, and of course they lie and they lie and they lie again. So it needs to be a public thing rather than, and that's a great policy for the branch to argue for. Over to you.
I hate to see all this booze go to waste, and we haven't really got time for a break. So maybe if we could just pass the bottle along the line, fill up. And the same with the bottles as well. If someone just wants to knock the top off, please do help yourself, because otherwise it's going to go to waste. So we're going to move into our Q&A session now. So we can probably have the lights on, I think. And would you like to sit down?
I'm just going to get my video running.
You get your video running. Okay. Quick quick 2 minutes and then we're back with a Q&A. Do you think we'd like to sit down for the Q&A at the front here, or go to stand? Or, some chair.
Yeah. Anybody else is like...
It's never going straight for Elizabeth. Young. These news
Is it? Makes a difference. Is it Bounty Staff?
No, you know it's the wrong one.